So, gather round close. This one's a bit spooky. Our today's story is about why the ancient Romans, these people who conquered half the world, built roads that still exist today, and created an empire that lasted centuries, were absolutely terrified of going to sleep alone. And when I say terrified, I don't mean a little nervous. I mean they genuinely believed that sleeping by yourself could get you killed, possessed, or worse. The reason isn't what you'd expect, and the more you learn about Roman beliefs around sleep and darkness, the creepier it gets. Let me paint you a picture of what nighttime was like in ancient Rome. We're talking about a world with no electric lights, no street lights, no flashlights, no sleep switches. When the sun went down, darkness fell like a heavy blanket over the city, and that darkness was absolute in a way modern people can barely imagine. Even in the poorest neighborhoods today, there's ambient light from somewhere. In Rome, once your oil lamp guttered out, you were in complete, total blackness. And Romans believed that darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a thing unto itself, a kind of substance that had weight and presence, and most importantly, it was full of things. Not metaphorical things, actual beings that existed in the dark and couldn't survive in the light. Spirits, demons, ghosts of the unburied dead, and creatures that had never been human at all. These weren't superstitions that educated Romans dismissed. These were fundamental facts of reality that everyone, from slaves to senators, believed absolutely. The Romans had a specific word for the spirits that wandered at night: larvae. Not the insect kind, but restless, malevolent spirits of the dead who hadn't received proper burial or who had died violent deaths. These larvae were hungry, not for food, but for life energy, warmth, breath, and they were especially drawn to sleeping people, because when you sleep, your spirit is vulnerable, partially detached from your body, wandering in dreams while your physical form lies defenseless. A sleeping person alone was like a beacon to these spirits. No witnesses, no one to call for help, no one to wake you if something started to go wrong. The larvae could approach, could lean over your sleeping form, could begin to drain away your life force or slip into your mouth and possess your body. Romans believed this wasn't just possible, it was common, a regular occurrence that explained all sorts of illnesses and strange behaviors. So the solution was simple: never sleep alone. Always have someone else in the room, preferably someone awake, or at least someone whose presence would divide the attention of any malevolent spirits. Two sleeping people were safer than one, because the spirits might hesitate, unsure which target to approach, and that hesitation might last until dawn, when the spirits had to retreat back into whatever shadows they emerged from. Wealthy Romans had slaves sleep in their rooms for exactly this reason, not primarily for service or security, though those were factors, but for spiritual protection. The slave might sleep on the floor at the foot of the bed, or on a small cot nearby, or sometimes even in the same bed if the room was cold. Their job wasn't just to be available if needed, it was to be present, to be another living soul sharing the space, dividing the darkness. And this wasn't considered weird or paranoid. This was normal, expected, the way you arrange your household for everyone's safety. A wealthy Roman who insisted on sleeping completely alone in a sealed room would be considered eccentric at best, suicidal at worst. People would wonder what they were trying to prove, or what dark bargain they'd made that they no longer feared the night spirits. Children never slept alone. Ever. Even infants had a slave or family member sleeping in the same room because children's spirits were thought to be especially loosely attached to their bodies, more likely to wander off during sleep and get lost or stolen by malicious entities. A child who died in their sleep was often assumed to have been stolen by larvae, or lemures, another category of dangerous night spirits. The lemures were particularly feared. These were the spirits of family members who had died but weren't at rest, either because they hadn't received proper funeral rites, or because they had unfinished business, or simply because they were angry about being dead. Unlike larvae, which could be any dead person's spirit, lemures had a personal connection to the household they haunted. They were your dead father, your deceased wife, your child who died in infancy.
And that personal connection made them more dangerous, not less, because they knew you, knew your routines, knew where you slept, knew your weaknesses. They could appear in dreams wearing familiar faces, could call you by name in voices you recognized, could trick you into leaving your body vulnerable while your spirit followed them into dangerous territory. The Romans had a festival called Lemuria, held in May, specifically dedicated to placating these household spirits. The paterfamilias, the head of the household, would walk through the house at midnight with his mouth full of black beans, which were thought to be repellent to spirits. He'd spit them out while walking, not looking behind him, saying, "With these beans I redeem me and mine," 9 times. The idea was that the Lemures would be distracted by picking up the beans and counting them, giving the family another year of relative peace. But even with these precautions, even with festivals and offerings and proper burial rites, Romans believed that sleeping alone significantly increased your risk. The presence of another person, even if they were also asleep, provided a kind of spiritual weight that anchored you to the physical world, made it harder for your spirit to drift too far during dreams. There was also the practical matter of the incubus and succubus. Romans believed in these entities long before Christianity adapted the concepts. The incubus was a male demon that would lie upon sleeping victims, pressing down on their chest, making it hard to breathe. The succubus was its female equivalent. Both were thought to drain vital energy through sexual contact with sleeping victims, leaving the person exhausted, weak, sometimes even dead by morning. Modern medicine recognizes what Romans called incubus attacks as sleep paralysis, a condition where you wake up but can't move, often accompanied by a sensation of pressure on the chest and vivid hallucinations. But to a Roman experiencing this, lying paralyzed in the dark, feeling something heavy pressing down on them, maybe even seeing a shadow figure looming over the bed, this was absolutely real and absolutely terrifying. Having someone else in the room meant that if you cried out during an incubus attack, someone might hear you and wake you, breaking the paralysis and driving away the demon. Sleeping alone meant you had to fight through it yourself, and Romans believed that some people simply couldn't, that they died in the night, their hearts giving out under the weight of the demon or their life force completely drained. The physical layout of Roman houses reflected these fears. Even wealthy homes with multiple rooms rarely had bedrooms designed for privacy in the modern sense. Sleeping chambers, cubiculum, were often small, sometimes barely big enough for a bed, because you weren't supposed to spend much time there. You slept, then you left. The idea of a bedroom as a personal sanctuary where you'd relax, read, or spend time alone would have seemed bizarre and vaguely dangerous. Slaves often slept in the same room as their masters or in connected rooms with doors left open. Family members slept near each other. In insulae, the apartment buildings where most Romans lived, families were crammed together in small spaces where privacy was impossible and sleeping alone wasn't even an option. But this wasn't seen as a hardship regarding sleep safety. It was seen as natural and appropriate. The Romans also believed that certain hours of the night were more dangerous than others. The time right after midnight, when the day had fully died, but dawn was still impossibly far away, was considered the most perilous. This was when spirits were most active, when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thinnest, when strange things could slip through. If you had to be awake during these hours, you took precautions. You kept lamps burning, multiple lamps if possible, because even though light didn't prevent spirits from existing, it limited where they could fully manifest. You kept someone with you. You might recite prayers or protective formulas. You definitely didn't wander around alone in the dark, because that was asking to be possessed, attacked, or simply lost, your spirit confused and unable to find its way back to your body.
Roman soldiers on night watch always worked in pairs or groups, partly for security, but also for spiritual protection. A lone sentry was vulnerable not just to enemy attack, but to supernatural assault. Stories circulated of sentries found dead at their posts with no marks on their bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, clearly killed by something that came from the darkness. The practice of keeping vigil over the dead, sitting with the body until burial, served multiple purposes. Obviously, it prevented the body from being disturbed by animals or stolen, but more importantly, it prevented the newly dead spirit from feeling abandoned and becoming a larvae or lemurs. The presence of living family members helped guide the spirit toward proper rest, rather than angry haunting. And it ensured that if the person wasn't actually dead, just in a coma or deep sleep, someone would notice when they woke up. Which brings us to another Roman fear, being buried alive. This happened more often than we'd like to think in a world without reliable methods of confirming death. And Romans believed that someone buried alive who died trapped in their tomb would become one of the most vengeful spirits imaginable, desperate to escape their prison and furious at the family who'd trapped them there. So, keeping vigil over the dead wasn't just mourning, it was protection. Protection for the dead person's spirit, protection for the family from potential haunting, and protection against the horrible mistake of premature burial. And during these vigils, family members never sat alone with the corpse. That would be dangerous for the living person, whose spirit might be drawn out by the newly dead, and dangerous for the dead person's spirit, which needed multiple living presences to help orient it toward peace rather than unrest. Dreams were another major factor in Roman fears about sleeping alone. Romans took dreams extremely seriously, believing they were genuine experiences your spirit had while your body rested, actual journeys to other realms where you might encounter gods, spirits, dead relatives, or prophetic visions. Dreams weren't just random brain activity, they were real events happening on a different plane of existence. This meant that going to sleep was genuinely dangerous because your spirit would leave your body and wander. If you slept alone, your body was unguarded during these journeys. Something could possess your empty body while you were gone,
Or something could follow your spirit back from the dream realm when you returned, slipping into your body alongside your spirit, sharing your flesh without your knowledge. Having someone else present meant that if your body started moving strangely during sleep, if you started speaking in voices that weren't yours, if you began to show signs of possession, someone would be there to notice and wake you, forcing out whatever had tried to enter. Sleeping alone meant possession could go unnoticed until it was too late, until the invading entity had fully merged with your body and couldn't be expelled. Romans also believed in something called the genius, a kind of guardian spirit that every person had, essentially your divine aspect or personal god. Your genius was supposed to protect you, but it could only do so much, especially at night when the forces of darkness were strong. Having another person nearby meant their genius was also present. 2 protective spirits instead of 1, better odds against the things that prowled the darkness. On your birthday, Romans celebrated your genius with offerings and prayers, essentially thanking your guardian spirit for keeping you alive another year. This wasn't a metaphor. They genuinely believed your genius had been fighting off threats all year, including threats that came while you slept. And they believed your genius was more effective at protecting you when you weren't isolated, when other people and their guardian spirits were nearby.
Let's talk about what Romans thought happened if you died in your sleep alone. This was considered a particularly bad death, not as bad as drowning or being murdered, but still problematic. Your spirit, dying without witnesses, might not realize it was dead. It might linger, confused, trying to wake the body that would never wake again. Eventually, it would figure out something was wrong, but by then it might be too late to make the proper journey to the underworld. Or worse, your spirit might be intercepted by malevolent entities that specifically hunted for souls detached from bodies. These entities could enslave your spirit, trap it, torment it, or consume it entirely, which was a kind of second death that meant complete oblivion rather than an afterlife. Romans feared oblivion far more than they feared the underworld, because at least in the underworld, you continued to exist in some form. If you died in your sleep with someone present, that person would ideally notice at the moment of death or shortly after, and could perform immediate rituals to help your spirit. They'd close your eyes, call your name 3 times, kiss your lips to catch your final breath, and begin the formal mourning that would guide your spirit toward proper rest. Dying alone meant none of this would happen, or would happen so late that your spirit had already gone astray. There were professional spiritualists in Rome, people who claimed they could communicate with the dead or had special knowledge of the spirit world. These people offered services to families worried about dead relatives, particularly those who had died alone or without proper rites. They'd perform rituals to locate the lost spirit, guide it toward peace, or at least appease it enough that it would stop haunting the family. These spiritualists did good business because Roman religion, unlike later Christianity, didn't offer much comfort about the afterlife. The underworld wasn't a punishment, but it wasn't exactly pleasant either. Spirits of the dead existed in a kind of pale half-life, conscious but diminished, and they could be deeply unhappy about it. An unhappy spirit who knew where its former family lived could make everyone's life miserable, especially at night, especially if family members slept alone and vulnerable. The Romans had another category of night spirits called strigae, which were either witches who could transform into bird-like creatures or demons that resembled such witches. The sources aren't clear. These strigae would fly through the night looking for vulnerable victims, especially children and people sleeping alone. They were said to drink blood like vampires or to feed on human flesh, particularly targeting infants. Mothers took elaborate precautions against strigae, including magical charms, protective symbols painted around cribs, and most importantly,
never leaving an infant alone at night. A baby sleeping with its mother or with a slave keeping watch was relatively safe. A baby left alone in a room, even just for a few minutes, was at serious risk. And if something happened to the baby, if it became ill or died, people would assume a striga had gotten to it during that brief moment of vulnerability. These beliefs weren't limited to uneducated or lower-class Romans. Educated, sophisticated Romans, people who read philosophy and understood mathematics and managed complex businesses, also believed in larvae and lemures and strigae. There were different levels of belief, certainly. Some people thought every creak in the night was a ghost, while others were more skeptical. But very few Romans were comfortable sleeping completely alone in a dark room, no matter how educated they were. The philosopher Pliny the Younger, who was definitely educated and sophisticated, recorded ghost stories as fact, including one about a haunted house in Athens where a phantom appeared every night, rattling chains and terrifying whoever slept there. The philosopher Lucretius, who tried to explain the world through natural causes without gods or spirits, still acknowledged that people experienced frightening things at night that seemed supernatural, even if he argued there were rational explanations. The prevalence of oil lamps in Roman archaeology tells us something interesting about these fears. Wealthy Romans had multiple lamps, far more than needed for practical lighting. Lamps were found in bedrooms, hallways, and atriums, suggesting that people kept many lights burning through the night. The expensive oil lamp was considerable, but apparently worth it for the psychological comfort and spiritual protection light provided. Some Roman homes had a small shrine to the household gods, the Lares and Penates, positioned near sleeping areas. These shrines usually included a lamp that was kept burning all night, every night, as an offering to the household deities and as a request for their protection during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Letting this lamp go out was considered inviting disaster, essentially telling your household gods you didn't need their help anymore.
The practice of keeping a nightlight wasn't just about seeing in the dark if you woke up. It was about maintaining a boundary of light, a circle of protection that spirits couldn't fully penetrate. The lamp was like a small artificial sun, and just as spirits fled from sunlight, they were at least weakened by lamplight. Not enough to prevent all supernatural activity, but enough to make you significantly safer. We know from Roman medical texts that doctors recognized what we call night terrors, sleep paralysis, and nightmares as distinct conditions, but their treatment recommendations often included spiritual as well as physical remedies. A patient suffering from frequent nightmares might be given herbs to help them sleep more peacefully, but also advised to wear protective amulets, make offerings to protective deities, and definitely not sleep alone, because isolation worsened these conditions. The amulets themselves are interesting. Archaeological finds include thousands of amulets that Romans wore for protection, many specifically designed to guard against night spirits. Some featured images of protective deities, some had inscriptions with magical formulas, some were shaped like eyes watching in all directions. Children especially wore these amulets, often from birth, because they were considered so vulnerable to supernatural threats. But no amulet was considered sufficient protection by itself. You needed multiple layers of defense: the amulet, the household shrine and its lamp, proper prayers and offerings, and most importantly, the presence of other living people. Spiritual protection was thought to work cumulatively, each layer adding to the others, and removing any one layer, especially the presence of companions, significantly increased your risk. There's evidence that Roman military camps maintained this practice even during campaigns. Soldiers slept in tents with multiple men per tent, partly for warmth and space efficiency, but also because having tent mates was considered essential for protection. A soldier who had to sleep alone for some reason, maybe on a special mission or guard duty, would take extra precautions, carrying protective amulets, saying specific prayers, and remaining as alert as possible. The Roman practice of crucifixion, horrible as it was, included a spiritual dimension that's often overlooked. Victims were left on crosses to die slowly, often taking days, and their bodies were usually left hanging as a warning to others. This meant the person died alone, in agony, without any of the proper rites or companionship that would help their spirit find peace. Romans believed these spirits became extremely vengeful and dangerous, haunting the area around the crucifixion site. Executioners and soldiers who worked at crucifixion sites took spiritual precautions seriously. They performed protective rituals, worked in groups, and avoided being alone anywhere near the crosses, especially at night. The spirits of the crucified were thought to be among the most dangerous, not just because they died horribly, but because they died in complete isolation, their spirits twisted by loneliness and agony into something monstrous. This belief about isolated death having spiritual consequences extended to other forms of execution and death. People who died in prison alone in cells were thought to become troubled spirits. People who died in accidents far from home, without family nearby, were mourned not just for their deaths, but for the spiritual danger their isolation created. Families would perform rituals even without the body present, trying to guide the distant spirit toward peace, despite the disadvantage of distance and isolation. The Romans also believed that spirits could communicate with the living through dreams, but this communication was more likely and more clear if you slept near other people. The theory was that spirits had limited energy and could only manifest strongly enough to enter dreams if multiple dreamers were present. A lone sleeper might experience confused, frightening dream fragments as spirits tried and failed to communicate. But multiple sleepers in the same space somehow amplified the signal, allowing spirits to send clearer messages. This is why important dream divination often happened in temples where multiple people would sleep together in a sacred space, hoping to receive dreams from the gods. The presence of many sleepers was thought to make the gods' messages clearer and more trustworthy. Sleeping alone to receive a dream would give you something, but it might be a deceptive message from a malicious spirit rather than genuine divine guidance.
The architectural design of Roman homes reflected these beliefs in subtle ways. Sleeping rooms were often positioned interior to the house, not on exterior walls, because external walls were thought to be more permeable to spirits entering from outside. Interior rooms, surrounded by other rooms where people lived and moved, had more protection. The life energy of the household concentrated in the center, providing better defense than rooms on the vulnerable periphery. Windows in sleeping rooms were small and few, partly for temperature control, but also because windows were seen as potential entry points for spirits. Large windows were for public rooms, atriums, and spaces where many people gathered. Sleeping rooms needed less light because you were supposed to sleep at night anyway, and small windows offered less opportunity for supernatural intrusion. Doorways had special significance in Roman spiritual protection. The god Janus, who guarded doorways and transitions, was invoked for protection at thresholds. Many Roman homes had symbols or inscriptions above doorways requesting Janus's protection.
But doorways to sleeping rooms needed extra protection because you'd be unconscious inside, unable to defend yourself if something harmful crossed the threshold. Some families used a practice where a slave or servant would sleep across the doorway of the master's bedroom, literally using their body as a barrier. This was considered one of the most protective arrangements because anything entering would encounter a living person first, alerting everyone to danger. The servant might not survive the encounter with a hostile spirit, but they'd provide warning, and their presence would weaken the spirit enough that others could respond. This practice seems cruel by modern standards, using a servant's body as a spiritual tripwire, but Romans viewed it differently. They believed the servant's own guardian spirit would be extra vigilant in this position, protecting not just the servant, but the whole household. And servants who performed this duty were often rewarded with better treatment, additional pay, or eventually manumission, freedom from slavery, because they were taking on genuine danger for the household's benefit. The fear of sleeping alone extended to Romans traveling away from home. Inns in the Roman Empire rarely offered private rooms for single travelers. Most accommodations were shared spaces where multiple travelers slept in the same room, partly because this was space efficient and profitable, but also because travelers wouldn't want to sleep alone in an unfamiliar place where the local spirits didn't know them and their guardian spirits were weakened by distance from home.
Traveling alone was considered dangerous for many reasons, but the spiritual vulnerability was significant. Away from your household gods, from family, from familiar surroundings, your spiritual defenses were compromised. Sleeping alone, on top of that, was like deliberately making yourself a target. Smart travelers found companions, even temporary ones, to share accommodations and provide mutual protection through the night. Roman soldiers on campaign often reported more ghost sightings and supernatural experiences than they did at home. This makes sense given the combination of stress, unfamiliar terrain, and sleeping in temporary camps far from home and household gods. But Roman military protocol adapted to these conditions with religious observances, sacrifices to protective deities, and strict enforcement of the rule that soldiers never stood watch alone. Ghost stories from military campaigns were taken seriously and often recorded. A military tribune named Julius Vindex reported seeing the ghost of Julius Caesar before a battle, which was interpreted as either a good or bad omen, depending on what the ghost said and how it appeared. These weren't dismissed as hallucinations or stress reactions. They were treated as genuine supernatural encounters requiring appropriate response. The practice of sharing sleeping spaces wasn't just about protection from hostile spirits. Romans also believed that sleeping near good people, virtuous people, provided positive spiritual benefits. Your character could be influenced during sleep by proximity to others. Sleeping near someone cruel or evil might expose you to bad influences, while sleeping near someone virtuous could improve your own character. This belief affected household arrangements. Masters wanted virtuous slaves sleeping nearby, not just for protection, but for positive influence. Parents carefully chose which slaves or which family members would sleep near children because the child's developing character was especially susceptible to these nocturnal influences. It wasn't enough to have anyone present. You wanted the right kind of person present. This gets into the Roman concept of contagion, not just physical contagion, but spiritual contagion. Spirits, both good and bad, were thought to be somewhat contagious, spreading from person to person through proximity, especially during sleep when people were vulnerable. This is why Romans were careful about who they allowed into their homes at night and who they slept near. The wrong companion could expose you to spiritual contamination, while the right companion strengthened your defenses. The Romans had purification rituals for people who'd been exposed to dangerous spirits or who'd had to sleep alone due to circumstances. These rituals involved washing with specific waters, making offerings to protective deities, wearing fresh amulets, and most importantly, sleeping near trusted family or friends for several nights afterward to restore their spiritual equilibrium. It was like recovering from an illness. You needed time and care to return to full strength. Some Roman religious sects and philosophical schools took these beliefs in different directions. The Pythagoreans, followers of Pythagoras, believed in reincarnation and had elaborate theories about the soul's journey during sleep. They still generally avoided sleeping alone, but for slightly different reasons related to their specific theology. The Epicureans, who believed gods existed but didn't interact with humans, were more skeptical of nighttime spirit dangers, but even they often slept near others out of habit and social convention, if not from belief.
The Stoics had an interesting position. They taught that you should face death without fear and shouldn't let superstition control your life. But in practice, most Stoics still followed conventional precautions about sleeping arrangements. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, slept with guards and servants nearby, maintaining the traditional protective arrangements even while writing philosophy about accepting whatever fate brings. Philosophy was one thing, but nobody wanted to test these beliefs by deliberately sleeping alone. The introduction of Christianity to Rome added new layers to these fears. Early Christians believed in demons and spiritual warfare, concepts that aligned well with Roman beliefs about night spirits. But Christians introduced the idea that prayer and faith in Christ could protect you even when alone, that calling on Jesus' name could banish demons more effectively than any pagan ritual. This was actually revolutionary and attracted converts partly for this reason. The promise that you could be spiritually safe even in isolation, even without the traditional protective arrangements, was appealing. It offered a kind of spiritual independence that Roman paganism didn't provide. Early Christian martyrs made a point of facing death alone, without fear, demonstrating this new source of protection to potential converts. But even among Christians, old habits died hard. Christian Romans still often slept near family members or fellow believers. They justified it differently, talking about Christian fellowship and community rather than spiritual protection, but the practical arrangement remained similar. Complete isolation during sleep remained uncomfortable, even for people whose theology theoretically protected them. Monasticism, which developed later, created structured environments where monks slept in dormitories, never alone. This was framed as fostering community and preventing sinful behavior, but it also continued the ancient pattern of never sleeping in isolation. Even hermit monks, who lived alone during the day, often returned to communities at night or had elaborate spiritual practices to protect themselves during solitary sleep. The Roman fear of sleeping alone influenced European culture for centuries after Rome fell.
Medieval bedrooms were shared spaces, not private sanctuaries. Servants slept in their masters' rooms, children slept with parents or siblings, and even wealthy nobles who could afford private chambers often chose to have attendants sleeping nearby. The idea of privacy during sleep, of sleeping alone by choice, developed slowly over many centuries. When private bedrooms became fashionable in the Renaissance and later periods, they were still often designed with servant access, small adjoining rooms where a servant could sleep in earshot. The truly isolated bedroom, where someone of wealth and status would sleep completely alone with the door locked, was a modern invention that would have seemed bizarre and dangerous to Romans. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum, the cities preserved by volcanic eruption, shows bedroom arrangements that confirm these practices. Bedrooms are small, and often multiple beds are found in a single room, or a small room opens directly off a larger bedroom. Bodies found in these homes were often in groups, people who died together during the eruption, suggesting they were sleeping in proximity when disaster struck.
The eruption of Vesuvius happened during the day, but evidence from the site shows nighttime sleeping arrangements. Small lamps found in bedrooms, often in multiples. Beds positioned near doorways for servants. Larger beds that would have accommodated multiple people. The physical evidence matches what written sources tell us about how Romans structured sleep for spiritual safety. One interesting detail is that Roman beds were often quite high, requiring steps to climb into them. This wasn't just about status or comfort. Height was thought to provide some protection from ground-crawling spirits and from the cold damp that rose from floors. But high beds also meant you couldn't easily see under them in the dark, creating a space where something could hide. Romans dealt with this by having servants check under and around beds before the master retired, and by maintaining that lamplight throughout the night. The servants who slept in masters' rooms had their own fears. They were there for the master's protection, but who protected them? Their own guardian spirits, hopefully, and the presence of the master provided some mutual protection. But servants were generally considered more expendable, more likely to be targeted by spirits, because their deaths would be less significant to the household. This created a hierarchy of vulnerability that servants were acutely aware of. Some servants requested to sleep in groups rather than alone with masters, believing that multiple servants together were safer. Masters who allowed this were considered kind, though it meant the master himself might be alone for periods if all servants were in an adjoining room. The negotiation of these arrangements reflected complex thinking about spiritual danger, social hierarchy, and practical protection. Roman inns and public houses also revealed these fears. The worst accommodations, the cheapest rooms, were often single rooms or isolated corners where travelers slept alone. Better accommodations meant shared spaces with other guests. The best accommodations offered by wealthy hosts included placement in rooms near family members or trusted household servants. The quality of accommodation was measured partly by how protected you'd be during sleep. Prostitutes in Rome worked in brothels, and one feature of these establishments was that sex workers never slept alone in their rooms.
They shared accommodations, partly for safety from physical threats, but also because sleeping alone in a place associated with so much activity, so many strangers, and so much potential spiritual contamination was considered extremely dangerous. The spirits that might accumulate in such a place were thought to be especially aggressive and harmful.
Criminals and outcasts who had no access to normal sleeping arrangements, who slept in alleys or abandoned buildings, were pitied not just for their physical hardship, but for the extreme spiritual danger they faced every night. Sleeping alone in an unsafe location with no protective rituals or companions was like offering yourself to any malicious spirit that happened by. That such people survived at all was sometimes attributed to spirits avoiding them because they were already so contaminated as to be uninteresting. The Roman fear of sleeping alone also connected to their understanding of madness. People who went mad were thought to have been possessed by spirits, and possession was most likely during sleep when you were vulnerable. Someone who slept alone regularly was considered at higher risk of madness because they had more opportunities for spirits to enter. Madness that developed suddenly was often attributed to a recent night spent sleeping alone, either by choice or circumstance. Treatment for madness included ensuring the afflicted person never slept alone, on the theory that the possessing spirit would be weakened by the presence of others and might eventually be driven out. This treatment was combined with exorcism rituals, offerings to healing gods, and various medicinal herbs. But the constant companionship during sleep was considered essential to recovery. Women in Roman society faced additional concerns about sleeping alone. They were considered especially vulnerable to certain types of spirits, particularly incubi and other predatory entities. A woman sleeping alone was thought to be at serious risk of supernatural assault, which could result in pregnancy by a demon, a concept that explained unexpected pregnancies and children born with abnormalities or unusual characteristics. This belief had dark implications for women's freedom and privacy. The insistence that women never sleep alone was framed as protection, but also served to control and monitor them. A woman who insisted on sleeping alone might be suspected of welcoming demonic lovers or practicing witchcraft. The spiritual justification reinforced social control.
Children who grew up in Roman households absorbed these fears from infancy. They never experienced solitary sleep as normal. It was always framed as dangerous and forbidden. By the time they were adults, the fear was deeply ingrained, not just intellectual, but emotional and visceral. The thought of sleeping alone produced genuine anxiety that went beyond rational belief into conditioned response. This conditioning was so effective that even Romans who traveled to places with different beliefs, who saw people in other cultures sleeping alone without apparent harm, still couldn't overcome their own discomfort. They might intellectually recognize that their fears were culturally specific, but emotionally they couldn't sleep alone without profound unease. The transition from Roman beliefs to medieval Christian beliefs maintained many of these fears under different theological frameworks. Medieval Europeans believed in demons, in the dangers of nighttime, in the vulnerability of sleep. The specific entities changed names. Pagan larvae became Christian demons, but the fundamental fear of sleeping alone continued, passed down through generations with remarkable consistency. It wasn't until the Enlightenment and the development of modern rationalism that sleeping alone became acceptable, even normal in some contexts. But even then, the transition was slow and incomplete. Many people maintained preferences for sleeping near others, justifying it with reasons about warmth, safety from physical threats, or simply comfort, not admitting to lingering supernatural fears that they'd been taught to dismiss as superstition. Today, we sleep alone routinely, in locked bedrooms, sometimes even preferring isolation during sleep for privacy and better rest. We've largely shed the specific beliefs about larvae and lemurs, but traces remain. Many people still feel uneasy sleeping alone in strange places. Children fear the dark and want someone nearby. We leave nightlights on. We keep phones next to our beds for connection. We feel more comfortable knowing someone else is in the house, even if they're in another room.
The Roman fears might seem irrational to us now, but they addressed something real: the profound vulnerability of sleep, the genuine strangeness of consciousness leaving during dreams, the very human fear of death and what comes after. Their solution: never sleep alone. Have others present to anchor you to life and to witness if something goes wrong, made sense within their understanding of reality. And maybe there's something we've lost in our modern isolation during sleep. The Romans, despite their fears, or because of them, maintained human connection even during their most vulnerable hours. They didn't face the night alone. They faced it together, with family, with household members, with the community of the living, providing mutual protection against whatever darkness might bring. Whether the spirits they feared were real or not, the connection they maintained was real. The comfort of not being alone when unconscious, the security of knowing someone would notice if you stopped breathing, the simple human warmth of proximity during vulnerable hours, these had value beyond supernatural protection.
So that's why Romans feared sleeping alone. Not because they were primitive or irrational, but because they took seriously the vulnerability of sleep and the thinness of the boundary between life and death, waking and dreaming, the physical world and whatever lies beyond. They believed the night was full of dangers, both physical and spiritual, and they protected themselves the only way they knew how, by refusing to face those dangers in isolation. Thanks for gathering close and listening to this one. May your own sleep be peaceful, whether you're alone or with others nearby. The Romans would probably approve of you listening to this before bed, since hearing stories together is another form of companionship. Goodbye and rest well.